Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mario Perez, and I'm the Vice President for University Advancement and the Chair and President of the Sonoma State University Foundation. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which will be facilitated by Dr. Robert Eyler. In January, President Judy Sakaki announced that Dr. Eyler would serve as Interim Associate Vice President for Government and Regional Relations. One of his many initiatives he has been working on with the Chancellor's Office is the release of this economic impact study, which was released earlier this month. We are all aware how Sonoma State University and the CSU system can transform the lives of our students. Now we have a study that demonstrates the return on investment the CSU has on the state of California. As a valued Sonoma State volunteer leader, we are excited to spend the next hour with you sharing this insightful information with all of you. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available after the program. In the coming days, we will also make available a one-sheet data page as it pertains to Sonoma State specifically. We are looking for an interactive conversation, so both the chat and Q&A features are enabled during the webinar. As you think of questions related to the presentation, please go ahead and get them to us in the Q&A feature. If you have any comments or technical issues, you can also put those in the chat feature as well. With that said, I'd like to acknowledge this program was a collaboration between the Office of University Advancement and the Office of Government Affairs. Now, I would like to hand it off to our facilitator, Dr. Eyler.
Thanks, Mario. Appreciate it. Can you see my screen? Awesome. Thank you. So folks, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the results of a study that have data inside of it based on the 2018-2019 fiscal year, but are really meant to provide an estimate of the economic footprint left by the CSU based on those data, but really thinking about it as a baseline looking forward to say, if we grow in a certain way, that impact, as we'll see later in this presentation, grows with the CSU, and more specifically, the region in which Sonoma State University lies, it grows with the university. So let's go through some of the basics, both of these types of studies and also how the CSU system went through its machinations to generate the report for all 23 campuses in the system as a whole. What it's meant to do is it's meant to measure the economic impact of, think of it this way, operational, capital, student, and alumni activity. So for example, every year our university has operational spending that has an economic impact like other businesses and employers throughout the region. We spend on capital. Capital employs certain firms, certain people on campus, that has its own additional impact. Then the students that come to the university have their impact based on their spending, part of which is spent on the operations and is not double counted, it's pulled out. But then they're assumed to spend beyond that in the community, which has its impact. And then, as we'll see later, one of the most important points of these economic impact studies is how alumni provide this slowly evolving, growing, massive footprint on the state economy, because they go from a high school graduate to a bachelor's degree or higher holder that provides them a larger rate of return on their education than they would have otherwise. And I'll break that down as we get closer to talking about alums. But the idea that this report is really trying to grab on what is the total economic value, if you will, of those sets of expenditures and how those folks basically engage with the state economy. The model used to do that estimate, based on certain assumptions about each one of those buckets, if you will, of spending on the state economy, is called IMPLAN. And if you're not familiar with IMPLAN, basically what IMPLAN does is it takes the supply and demand sides of the economy, puts them into a gigantic matrix, and says if you turn up one part of the economy a little bit versus everybody else, you'll see some effects go through hundreds of industries because of these economic connections that happen through what they call a supply and demand matrix. So when you look at the university line in terms of providing that economic capacity, there are hundreds of industries that are affected by the university's presence in Rohnert Park, ultimately in Sonoma County, and then beyond in California. And this is true for each of the CSU campuses. We're going to use 2018-19 data for this, not 2019-20. So the results were delayed a little bit because of COVID-19. So keep that in mind, that these data are slightly old, but they ultimately make a statement about the current state of affairs as 2021 opened up. The consultancy that did this work is called ICF, and ICF also did something similar in 2004 and also over the 2009-2010 period, another time period in which recession took place. And so the CSU system rehired ICF to keep the methodology, at least in theory, consistent. And what we're ultimately going to see in terms of the inside of those impacts are the total spending, the total jobs supported, because the supposition is as we spend money as in the university and as our students spend money and as our alums make money and spend money, there are jobs supported, wages are paid in those businesses that both alumni own and also are affected by the contracts at the university and also how students spend, and then ultimately have some fiscal impacts on our state and local economies through tax receipts. The geography is also split. So the CSU system asked ICF to look both regionally and statewide. We're going to see this in just a minute when I show you a little bit more data specific to certain regions, and they're going to break up the regions into 5 or 6 categories, but they all add up to the statewide effects. And what we're looking for Sonoma State's purposes is the effect on the Bay Area economy. So the Bay Area economy is made up of 10 counties, sort of the classic 9 plus Solano County. And so when you add all those together, Lake Mendocino, Sonoma, Napa, Marin, San Mateo, San Francisco, Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and then Solano County, you're getting the 10 Bay Area counties. The way it works is that you think of the university's presence as like a rock being thrown into a still pond. And we call the university's presence and its alumni the direct economic impacts. And from there are ripple effects out into the other parts of the economy. The indirect impacts are linked directly to those direct impacts, meaning that there's vendor contracts, there's spending directly by students and alumni, and then the so-called induced impacts spread their wings further because of how that spending affects other employees, other businesses, and there's another round of spending. When you add all that up, you get the so-called total economic impacts, and that's really what the big numbers are that I'm going to show you over the next few slides with respect to how the report gave us those data and did those estimates. Okay, so here are those regional numbers, and in fact, I was wrong. They actually split it into 8 regions, but the key is the first one, which is the Bay Area region, and you can see that here. Now, we actually share that Bay Area region with 4 other CSU campuses: Cal Maritime, San Francisco State, San Jose State. So Santa Clara County actually is the 11th county. I forgot there's 11 counties, is part of that Bay Area region, and then Sonoma State. So about $3 billion, 3.3 is spent in that 2018-19 fiscal year time period. That employs overall, including all the additional effects, about 30,000 workers. So the idea is that 3.3 billion supports about 30,000 jobs. The wage income that comes from those 30,000 jobs is approximately 1.9 billion. The total amount of income for businesses based on all the spending that takes place due to that 3.3 billion of activity at those 5 campuses is about 4.7 billion. So let me stop there and explain that. One of the things about an economic impact study is the idea called a multiplier effect. So if you take that 4.7 and divide it by 3.3, that number is what you think of as the multiplier effect of the university's operations on this region. And then the tax impact of that is approximately 255 million, or somewhere, between, let's say, 7 and 8% of the direct economic impacts. Now you can see in the other regions, there's some larger numbers and some smaller numbers, and that's really just more of an artifact of how ICF broke up the state. Now, if you look at how all 23 campuses and basically Long Beach, where the CSU system is located, have impacts on California overall, here are the big numbers. About 26.9 billion. So if you took the numbers on that last slide and added them all up, that economic activity, the total dollar figure, is about 26.9 billion. 10.3% or 10.3 billion of that 26.9 billion is basically wages and salaries. 1.6 billion of that is state and local tax revenue. So really nice fiscal support in that sense. And it supports overall just under 210,000 jobs. And that's based on its current footprint. So the more that's spent, and we'll talk about this right at the end, the more that's spent on the CSU system, the bigger those ripple effects get, and the larger the multiplier effect is in terms of its ability to grab onto more of the economy. And what they concluded was this, and this is kind of one of the numbers that run around as sort of a big statement number, is that for every dollar invested in the CSU generally, meaning that sort of, let's think of the median CSU spending, you get about $7 back, $6.98 for every dollar. So you think about that and you say, okay, what does that really mean? What it means is when you spend $1, whether you're the state of California, whether you're the federal government, or whether you're a donor, you meant to get about $7 on average back on that for the state of California with respect to return on investment in total economic activity. And a lot of that is just on the operational side. There's a little bit on the capital side, but a lot of that comes from the fact that every year the CSU campuses open up again and we basically renew with a new student body. So recruiting drives a lot of that 1-to-7 ratio. And then the $29.90 is when you stack alumni on. So the idea that we graduate people who now have larger economic capacity based on their degrees that they earn, whether they be bachelor's degrees or master's degrees at the CSU system, they add a lot of additional economic value to the state. And that's really where, to understand completely how the university system generates a large economic impact on the state of California, we provide a workforce. And that workforce, when they're staying in California, and this only measures folks that have stayed in California, you get that nice additional bump to that ratio, almost $30 of return on $1 invested. And that's because that alumni base gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. Okay. So based on Sonoma State's direct spending, we had about 253 million as measured in the report. That was the direct economic impact. So if you keep that ripple effect that I showed you on one of the first slides in mind, what we're doing now is breaking down where that rock that gets thrown into that still pond comes from for Sonoma State University. About 214 operationally, about 13 million more or less as a 4-year average on capital, about 14 million on other auxiliaries and sort of ancillary spending otherwise on campus, and about 12 million in the region of student spending. So you add all that up, you get 253 million, and that gives that extra pop to the local economy. So the idea is that that's the rock that gets thrown in the pond, but the activity of the alums add another 1.1 billion to that number based on their presence in the Bay Area region and ultimately in California. So that when you add all that up, Sonoma State University generating more and more alums increases the impact, and we'll break all that down in just a minute. But that's the direct spending. So that's, in a sense, operationally, 253 million is the key number on the operations side. The alumni we'll see in a minute. Okay. So while most of the effects stay in Sonoma County, we do have some proliferation out into the greater Bay Area, and ICF kind of, broke that down in the broader study. But to summarize, these are the annual economic benefits on the Bay Area based on that amount of spending from operations, and then ultimately adding the alumni that are in the Bay Area to this. So if you take both those numbers and put them together, you get 9,730 jobs, more or less, supported by Sonoma State University's operations and alums that are in the Bay Area, 1.63 billion in economic activity, and then about 102 million of state and local revenue that are provided to local governments from just the Bay Area region. So when you take operations only, that 253 million we just broke down in the last slide generates about another 305 million on the Bay Area economy. So that's the multiplier of Sonoma State alone, and that's on operations. And then you add the alums on top of that, and that's where the 1.63 billion comes from. So you're getting that 1.1 billion on top of the 558, and you're getting that 1.63 in sum. So, and there's a little bit of rounding there, so just in case you're a little confused on where the 1.63 comes from. that 1.02 billion, that add on, that nice big piece is going to get added in when you start talking about what happens outside the Bay Area. So we're priming the pump and saying, look, we know the core outcome from Sonoma State happens in the Bay Area. But when we add to that what happens outside, we get even more. So 1.02 billion coming up for SSU alums that are outside the Bay Area. And that's why the statewide, we'll see in a minute, is as large potentially as 2.68 billion. So think about that. We spend 253 million per annum. We have alums that sort of this lumbering amount of spending going alongside and getting bigger every year because we graduate more alums. And we get 2.68 billion in the end. So the dot connectivity is to think that the presence of Sonoma State on an annual basis creates this ever-growing effect on the California economy. And in the 2018-19 fiscal year, this is the estimate, 2.68 billion on the state overall. Now, we can break this down a little bit more categorically. The regional impact, the 558, you can see on that one line. So if you take the 253 million and you break down what that supports, that's that first bolded number, the regional impact. Then you add the regional alumni impact and you get that extra boost. So those two top lines are really what happens in the Bay Area, bolded operations and all that goes into the operations of Sonoma State on an annual basis, and then the alumni impact stacked on top. That's where we get the 1.63. Now, when you take what happens outside the Bay Area and add that, there's not an enormous amount that our operations affect outside the Bay Area. And you can see there's very little difference between that second bolded line under the industry activity column, 584 versus 558. Not a big deal there, but where the real big boost comes from is the additional alums. That 2.099 number within versus the 1.073. So our alumni living all over the state, really, almost double, not quite, but almost double the impact from the alumni that happened just in the Bay Area. And the sum of the parts where we get the 2.68 is the 584 plus the 2.099. So that statewide impact is the sum of those final two numbers, third data column called industry activity. And that's what generates the number of 2.68 billion on the state. But look at all the jobs also. Look at how many wages are paid. Look at all the fiscal impact. So there's a lot of great things that happen as a result of Sonoma State's annual activities and the growth of our alumni base. And this table basically breaks all that down. You can see those two line items there and then the big one there. Okay. To add a little extra spice to this, think of it this way, because you could say these numbers, okay, this is great, but relative to what? Well, if you think about what it does per student, which is a nice metric, and inside the academy, we tend to use per student measures as one of the key core measures that we're looking at. The Sonoma State effects is about the 7th largest in terms of per campus in the CSU system of the 23 campuses. So we rank relatively high in terms of when you spend at Sonoma State, you're getting some of the larger impacts on the California state economy of any of the 23 campuses. We're 7th out of 23. And that's just for now. That's just based on the 2018-19 year. But as you probably gleaned from what I've said thus far, one of the things about this report is it really talks at length, and obviously the numbers show this out, as to the importance of alumni to the much larger number. So if you think about that, we're really taking high school students and folks that maybe in some cases just have a GED or coming back to college life because they want to fulfill lifelong dreams of education. We take them and we generate a larger economic capacity. And so this report is very careful not to double count. It really is just taking, when it thinks about those alumni impacts, it's really just taking the difference between what they get by earning a bachelor's degree or a master's degree at the California State University, and specifically for our case, Sonoma State University, and what they could have earned, or at least an assumption about what they would have earned had they not had that degree and had something less. So that difference is what you're getting with that alumni impact. It's not the total amount that's being spent or earned by alums. It is just the difference between an assumed amount without the degree and what they're making with the degree. So that's a huge part of this. And why that's so important is because that's truly the economic transformation we do as a university. Now, when you think about the return on investment specific to Sonoma State, remember early in this presentation, we talked about just under $7 for every dollar that's spent, just under $30 when you add alumni for every dollar that's spent. Well, for Sonoma State, remember, because that was the average, since Sonoma State is the 7th highest out of the 23, our impact is slightly higher than the CSU average, $7.65 per dollar spent at Sonoma State, and about 35 when you add alumni in terms of statewide industry activity. So we provide an amazing rate of return if you put all those pieces together, whether you are giving, whether the state of California makes a larger investment, or whether the federal government makes that investment. But every dollar, in a sense, has the same basic impact. And so these numbers are meant to be one-stop shopping in terms of saying, okay, when I spend that dollar, what do we get in California? This is the amount of economic activity the ICF study estimates has taken place. So think about that in terms of when you think about where that dollar goes. But let's think about this like one level deeper. So one of the things I like to do when I'm explaining this, especially when I'm basically a peer review. So one of the things about me that's kind of different around the CSU government affairs crew is I'm relatively well trained in economics and have done some of these studies. So I know more or less what goes into them, and also can think about, okay, well, there's a couple of caveats here. Well, one is the data are a couple of years old. Now, one thing about COVID-19 is it shifted budgets, but now we're seeing some shift back in Sacramento. So the core budget that's spent locally may come more or less back to what it was a couple of years ago. The other piece is it also shows the importance of donors being engaged, because when donors get engaged, it really does enhance not only students' lives, but really the lives of all of California and residents and workers. The region in reality is really smaller. It's really better to think locally when you think about the operations, but it's much better to think about statewide when you're talking about all the alums, because alumni cross borders all the time in terms of where they are, where they work, where revenue is generated. So when we think about operations, we almost should think hyper locally. When we think about the alumni impact, we should really look at the statewide level as the number one statement. But so one of the tricky parts about, and sort of a caveat here, thinking one level deeper, is the region is kind of an abstraction from reality, in that it's really just trying to say, look, we got to carve the state up a certain way. Here's how we're going to do it. The statewide impact really tells the story in terms of how the alums work. And for our purposes, Sonoma County and the North Bay really tell on the operations side. Now, do we think that Sonoma State has a relatively large impact locally? And the answer is sure they do. It's a relatively large employer. So just like any other large employer, we spend a lot of money locally, and some of those numbers just play it out. Could more be done? And the answer is absolutely. So the other thing that these kind of studies do is really kind of, it describes the supply chain connections and the ways in which we can enhance those economic relationships. But the alumni are the key. And like I said, I can't emphasize this more strongly. That dollar, regardless of its source, has a very similar impact statewide. So this is really the importance of philanthropy to the university, is that those dollars go a long way in enhancing our graduates and also the state of California. So with that, I will now look and see if we have some chat questions, and it looks like we do not. So we will open it up for questions. Please use the Q&A function or the chat to ask any questions you like, but I'm hoping that this was helpful for you. If there's a question you think about after we're done here, that's my email address and that's my Twitter handle at BOBBY7007. Don't hesitate to reach out to me for any questions, statements, anything you like in terms of me helping trying to understand this better, but also me providing you with more information as the case may be. So Mario, I'll hand it back over to you. Otherwise, I did have something come through. Travis asked, how does this rank among other CSU campuses? We're 7th out of 23. I did say that, but no worries. From just thinking about what it is per student, right? We're a relatively small campus, but on a per student basis, based on the attendance levels in the 2018-19 fiscal year or academic year, as the case may be, we're 7th out of 23 in terms of our impact based on our operational spending. You're welcome.
Thank you, Rob.
You bet.
This is information I know many of the vice presidents of advancement have been expressing to the chancellor's office that they've been looking for. Oftentimes when we're in front of our community constituencies, people want to know what the return on investment is. So I think this is a fantastic study that was done and really helps paint a picture of the value of the educational system of the CSU, and more specifically Sonoma State, and how it helps our region. And it is enlightening to see that, you know, compared to the other 23 campuses, we're number 7, which is fantastic. Again, any other questions?
I do see that Henry has his hand raised, so I'm going to click the allow to talk and see if Henry can ask this question.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Henry.
Hi, how is everybody doing? I'm curious. I don't think in terms of student size, we're 7 out of 23. Aren't we actually somewhat smaller than that? So we're really, you know, outperforming the system.
Henry, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question or making that statement. You're 100% correct. That's why I look at it per student, because if we think about the reason we're here, it's because of the students. So when investment is made, it's really should be made with the idea of the student in mind. And so we just happen to be a smaller campus, but we have a lot of bang for buck in that sense.
I mean, that's how I'm getting it. But can you give us a rank? I mean, is Sonoma State like the 14th largest out of 23? Is it
I want to say it's 18 or 19, depending on the day of the week.
So it's one of the smaller campuses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the smallest 4 or 5, generally speaking.
Wow. I mean, good for us.
Absolutely.
To have that level of impact. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think those numbers as well you're mentioning, Rob, and Henry, thank you so much for joining us today. Really do appreciate it in the question. And the numbers you talk about when you think about the workforce development as well of our alumni sector and what that's doing and the importance of it. Maybe if you can just reiterate a little bit the importance of it to our local economy.
Oh, absolutely. So if you think about, I talked earlier about how the local operations have a certain amount of job support. Let me actually roll that back. That if you look at that line item, our regional impact supports about 4,600 jobs. Now that's technically Bay Area wide the way they studied it, but most of those jobs are going to be in the North Bay by the nature of how the economics works and how we share the Bay Area with those other larger campuses, except for Maritime. But San Jose State, San Francisco State, and East Bay are going to eat up an enormous amount of some of those impacts as far as going, let's say, you know, Contra Costa County south and also creeping up into Marin with respect to San Francisco State. But for Sonoma State, most of it's going to be North Bay based. So if you think about how the 1,300 or so workers on our campus, their spending, our student spending, our operational spending supports over 3 times that number regionally. But most of that 4,600 is probably within Sonoma, Napa, Lake Mendocino, and Marin counties.
Those numbers are just absolutely impactful when you think about it and think of the future of the region as well.
Yeah, and so one of the things about it too, and this is something, and there's enormous number of stories bandied about, but if we think we have a shortage of bachelor's and higher degree holders that will be demanded by employers over, let's say, the next 10 years, the CSU has an enormous potential impact on filling that gap. And we hear numbers that range all the way from 700,000 short to 1.1 million short. And either way, even if it's 500,000, our ability to generate trained workforce is key to filling that gap if it exists. And so in that way, we have a pivotal role in the future of California in terms of closing that gap and ultimately being a more productive state.
It looks like Linda Reed has a question. I think we're going to unmute her.
Hi, Rob. I just wanted to understand the tax impact, that number. Could you explain that to me?
100%.
Thanks.
Totally. So the way that these studies work, they estimate based on economic activity, the taxable transactions, the amount of personal income tax, the amount of corporate income tax, the amount of property taxes that are supported that are new based on housing and other property transactions, and then they add those all together with respect to the current tax code. So one of the real challenges for M-Plan is to stay up on myriad tax codes throughout the United States, and they really limit their set of models to the United States, and trying to figure out what are the major categories that are really drivers of the tax revenues that go into cities, counties, and the state. And so generally speaking, it's going to be income, transactional taxes like sales tax, property taxes, a number of fees, and other sort of local taxes and duties. And when you add all those up, you get the sum as those so-called tax impacts. Now, the key is the recognition that the industry activity number is the superset. The wages / labor income and the taxes are paid out of that industry activity number. So they're not meant to necessarily added, they're not meant to be additive. The industry activity captures everybody, but when you break down some of those other numbers, it tells you what proportion ends up in local and state government, but also in the hands of workers as wages.
So can you hear? So for instance, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So for instance, all the people that we hire here at Sonoma State University, if they have a home and they pay taxes on it, that would go into this figure.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I get it. Thank you, Rob.
Of course. And I can add a little bit of that just for a little extra spice. And that is that, there's also a lot of non-taxable transactions we have, like food. So when we buy groceries, that's part of the industry activity, but not necessarily part of the taxes. So that's why you might say, well, that seems like a relatively small percentage. And the answer is, well, part of that's because we have a lot of spending that, we don't have taxes on rent. We don't have taxes on food. But it's meant to estimate and capture what portion of that industry activity ultimately ends up generating a little bit more fiscal impact. And what it really reminds us is that the university does have a local fiscal impact. That's also one of the biggest pieces of power of that data, is that while we may not pay things that another business or employer would pay to the local municipality, we have a lot of so-called indirect positivity that goes into the local and regional economy with respect to state and local taxes.
Again, if anybody has a question, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A section.
Great question.
Okay. Looks like we're getting to the end here. Doesn't look like we have too many, any more questions. With that, I will go on ahead. This is, again, fantastic information. We will, again, make a one-sheet data sheet available in the coming days. We're finalizing those numbers and putting it together, and we'll be able to share it with everybody and make it available moving forward. Again, this is fantastic information. As we continue to talk with our communities and advocate for Sonoma State, we would like everybody to reference the study and show the impact Sonoma State's having on not only our regional but our state economy. And as Henry mentioned earlier, we are outperforming when you look at it by way of our size and everything. It looks like we do have one more question, Rob. Emily Miller has asked, we talked a lot about how it impact alumni and community. How does this impact our student population?
Emily, that's a great question. So there's two major ways in which our alums impact our students, most specifically regionally, but we could think of it as throughout the state of California. And that's one is hiring them as interns or potentially being a network for them on the other side once they graduate. That's kind of one big ball in terms of how that works. The second is being a mentor. So whether you hire that student or provide a network for them to get out into the workforce, that's one way. But because an alum has the experience of being on campus and has the experience of being off campus with the degree, the supposition is that they can also help as a mentor. So those are usually the two ways in which these studies, but also just the university, thinks about what are the most direct connections between alums and the current student body. That's it. The one is more economic. The second one is a little bit more social and cultural, if you will.
It also plays into the philanthropic opportunities as well, Emily. Alumni who participate in our community, members at large who participate in philanthropic support, those help the programs that the students are participating in. So as we look toward the future, if there's a fantastic classroom to career program or mentorship, some of the elements we're looking to do. I know our alumni department is working on a mentorship program online. So these are the elements that we're able to put in place that help the students directly basically get in touch with our alumni, move forward and prepare for the future workforce.
Great question.
Okay, we're going ahead and wrap this up today. Again, I want to thank everybody for attending. This is fantastic information. We do have, please, I am also going to go ahead and plug our first ever Giving Day starting tomorrow. It's up and running on our site, and we look forward to everybody participating. And we hope to have some more of these webinar discussions with more information coming out of the university and providing to each one of you valued members of our volunteer organizations. With that, everybody have a fantastic day, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thanks, everybody.